Boarding is almost completed, so I think we can start. And a very warm welcome from my side to this session of Hermes Cover Click and Coffee, the global economic outlook post-COVID-19. A very special episode, if you ask me, because not only do we have a very interesting topic to discuss, but also we have very interesting panelists today, very special guests. My name is Sophia Schultz-Renz. Maybe just to introduce myself briefly, I work for the German Export Credit Guarantee Scheme since around about 7 years now, and I'm heading the Department for Country Bank and Sector Analytics. So, as you can probably guess, as an economist, this topic is very close to my heart, and I can't wait for the discussion. But as I said, I'm not in focus today, but my panelists, which I would like to introduce to you just now. And let me start with Ludovic Subran. Ludovic, in preparation to this event, I went through your CV, and actually my first thought was I could fill this whole hour just discussing your career and going step by step through it. But unfortunately, the topic was already fixed, so I will limit myself to the very highlights. Ludovic, you're the chief economist of Allianz and Euler Hermes, and prior to joining Allianz, you worked for the World Bank, the United Nations World Food Programme, the French Ministry of Finance, just to mention a few. And as a French national, you are also a member to the Council of Economic Advisors to the French Prime Minister. Also, Ludovic has been ranked by Richtopia among the top 100 most influential economists, and also sits on several boards of directors and advisory boards. He's adjunct professor of economics to different universities. Plus, Ludovic, you're fluent in 7 languages, which I found very impressive. But I guess overall we can say you're an expert in economics. So it's a pleasure to have you on the panel today, an absolute honor. A warm welcome from my side. And of course, I don't want to miss our second panelist, Edna Schöne. Edna, actually the same holds true for your CV, also so many interesting aspects, but also here I will limit myself to the cornerstones of your career. Edna, you have a background as a lawyer, and about 20 years you worked in different roles within the German Export Credit Agency, and amongst others, you have worked in the legal department, you've designed and established the sustainability department, you have led the Berlin Liaison Bureau, and since 2015, you are now a member of the board of the Euler Hermes AG. And here you are responsible for the German Export Credit Guarantee Scheme, as well for the legal and compliance area department or division for the whole DACH area. You're also member of a diverse range of advisory boards and supervisory boards, and I'm not sure how many languages you are actually fluent in, Edna. I just know of German, English, and Swedish. Is that correct?
Well, I actually speak fairly well French, I would say, and my Hebrew is very rusty, but I used to speak Hebrew fluently as well, but I wouldn't say that anymore because it's many years ago, yeah.
Very good. And Hebrew is very interesting, but yeah. So also a very warm welcome to you from my side, and thanks for being with us today. So one expert in economics, one expert in the export industry in the broad field of global trade finance. So what else could we wish for to discuss the global economic outlook? And at this stage, maybe one information to the audience. Of course, you're more than welcome to participate in the discussion with any questions you may have. You can post them via the chat function in your WebEx window on the bottom right, and we will come back to your questions later on in the session. But now let's dive into the topic. First of all, I must confess, when I read the title to this event for the very first time, my immediate question was, is it already the right time to discuss about post-COVID outlook? Aren't we still in the middle of it? Of course, trade levels are returning to pre-crisis level. Governments around the globe are considering or already building back corona measures. And also our daily life slowly returns back to somewhat normal circumstances. But from a pure economic perspective, is it already the right time? Are we in post mode? And nonetheless, all of us are always on the lookout for favorable perspectives and opportunities, and for this we need prognoses. I think the past couple of months have taught us very clearly that any prognosis is just as good as the assumptions we base them on, and assumptions are very hard to define, especially in the current times of high uncertainty. And that is why I'm so glad to have Ludovic on the panel today, because I know he and his team have worked the past couple of weeks on building different scenarios for an outlook, and I hope you will share them with us right now in your keynote to our discussion. So I hand over to you, Ludovic.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and thank you, Edna, for the invites. You asked a very good question, which is it a good time to start speaking about the recovery? I think it is, because otherwise we're going to speak about this virus for years. You know, the virus has become endemic in a way, right? And so the question is, how do we handle the fact that we have to live with this forever virus? And you already see that in the health policy, they started to change a bit the rhetoric. They just stopped counting the death, and they start looking at incidents differently. In Germany, like in France, as of October 15, we're going to start paying for the tests. That's going to change also a bit the metric. But more importantly, because today we're talking to the trade community. Trade was one of the first sector that rebounded from the crisis. Actually, trade rebounded twice as fast from this crisis than during the 2008-2009 crisis, because there was no financing crunch. There was no credit crunch. So today, I will talk about the economic outlook, but I will really take the lens of global trade, because I think it's a story of a recovery. The story, which is very interesting, is that to avoid recession and insolvencies and unemployment, governments and central banks are very quick to act. And as a result, we have now a bit more debt and a bit more inflation. And this is very important for trade, because the pressures we see on trade today are a bit finger pointed at everywhere. In Germany, everybody's very worried about inflation. It's something that is very Jungian about Germany, because in the past 100 years, twice were the German savers expropriated because of the hyperinflation of 23, but also the post-war currency devaluation. So when you see what's happening now, when you talk to businessmen all across Europe, but especially in Germany, where the manufacturing sector has helped with Germany's resilience, they're very concerned about the margins. They're very concerned about the price of inputs. So I will talk a little bit about that today. So let me share a few slides. I mean, I call this export me if you can. It's like catch me if you can. I have the impression when I talk to people that half of them realize that export is the solution, and still half of them actually tend to be very affected by the deglobalization rhetoric. I've always been so miffed about people that explain to us after every crisis that trade is dead, globalization is dead. If there is one lesson that this crisis showed us, is that actually the solution lies in trade. I was just mentioning the resilience of the German economy. You can mention the resilience of the economic resilience of all of the trade oriented countries. And as I said, if you look at this chart on the left, trade has rebounded one of the fastest compared to GDP, compared to last crisis. In 2021, trade in volume terms will rebound by 8%, and in value terms by 17%. And if we look into 2022, we still think there is, quite strong tailwind for global trade, coming mostly from Asia Pacific, where intra-regional trade is very strong, but also from Europe and also from North America. So we continue to see quite a positive support from global trade, and we continue to tell to all of our clients, all our prospects, don't listen to trade has always been complicated. As long as trade has existed, it's been a question of trade barriers or not, right? And the Trump years just before COVID were quite a catastrophe when it came to going back to the 70s type of trade environment. But trade is strong, and yes, there is a deceleration. We see as fall arrived, we sense this deceleration. Mostly because of the deceleration in China. The Chinese consumer will not save the world this time. And therefore, the emerging markets are very affected by this because the exports to China are affected. Yes, some companies and some supply chains are extremely constrained by the lack of availability of industrial inputs, by the cost So this starts having a toll a little bit on the vibrance of global trade. But look, if you just look at, the past, again, 4 years, if you think about how the crisis could have been catastrophic for global trade, all the borders of the world were closed. 3/4 of the world GDP was on some form of lockdown at one point, and yet trade rebounded like a phoenix. So for me, this is very important to tell that story. And again, to answer your question, yes, we should talk about recovery in trade because it's already there. And now we have to handle the post-crisis legacies. And one of them, of course, is inflation. So supply chains after every crisis are particularly affected. This crisis is very specific because, of course, it was a lockdown crisis. And so even though it affected services much more than goods, it did affect and continues to affect, because of zero COVID policy, a lot of the infrastructure of trade, ports, airports, trade routes. And you remember what happened with the ship that got clogged into the Suez Canal. You remember, and you see what has been happening with the closure of the port in China. This is something that is very vulnerable. I think this crisis has exhibited the vulnerabilities, the physical vulnerabilities of the trade routes. And this crisis has certainly shown that the dependence we have on some supply chains are very complicated to manage when you have the type of delivery times that you see now, which you have in the middle of this chart. And another issue, which is really, and this is not only about logistics and inputs, another issue is really this massive acceleration of trade prices. Global trade prices have increased to the tune of, in this graph here, you see only the container prices, and the container prices have increased almost 4 times. So if you take a container from Shanghai to Marseille, it's 4 times the price that it was, 2 years ago. And the big question is whether this is going to stick or this is going to go. I believe there are very strong reasons why part of it will stay, just because, trade is going into a more sustainable path, maybe because the price of trade was very low before, but I think most of it should go. I still continue to believe that there is a bit of micro hoarding, people being concerned and ordering 2 containers instead of 1. I still think we need to work on infrastructure of trade. We maybe have not invested as much as we should have in the past 10 or 20 years, and now we see these vulnerabilities. And more importantly, there are some structural trends in trade that I'm not sure are going to stick. One, for discussion that I'm still trying to understand myself because the data is not available, is what I call the Amazonization of trade. The fact that in a container today, you have finished electronic goods in a much higher proportion than imported goods for construction or some industrial equipment. And that changes completely the value of the container, and therefore the whole price of trade is much more sensitive to what is in there. If you fill containers with finished electronic goods, you're going to have fewer containers to transport something that is of much lesser value. If you have a full container of industrial input, the total price of the container is between $20,000 and $50,000. If you have a full container with, phones and chips and whatnot, the price of the container is $500,000. So you see that there is also this disruption in what are in the containers, which is very much linked to lockdown economics. We stopped consuming services, we started to consume stuff to refurbish our home, and in a way, we don't see when we click online that we are, getting a bit more pressure on global trade and certainly substituting for some of the industrial inputs. Why is this important? For the people in the audience that listen to us, we see that the cost of this supply disruption, so the logistical disruption, but also the price disruption, and the two are, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg story. This is costing between 2 and 3 points of margins, depending on the sector. In the car industry, for example, this is quite massive, a shock in terms of supplying the right electronic equipments, but also in terms of rethinking the dependencies of supply chains. And I will come to that because, as you know, after every crisis like that, policymakers usually come to the front stage and tell us that we need to reshore everything. That's mostly because those people have never worked in an actual company and don't know what reshoring means, and I will come to that in a minute. Because of the very situation of emerging markets, and because most of you are in Europe, I just wanted to really give you this outlook on what's happening on emerging markets, because I think this is very important for trade, for German trade. Europe is rebounding quite nicely. You know, the US is rebounding quite nicely. I'm not very concerned there. I'm much more concerned whether we're going to have an emerging market cycle this time around. Because for the emerging markets today, there is a form of a double whammy, even a triple whammy if you think about the vaccine access, which may cause even more lockdown in the emerging world. But the double whammy I'm thinking about is the future tightening of financial conditions in dollar as the Fed normalizes its monetary policy. It's going to be long. The Fed is going to stay behind the curve. There is no, taper tantrum like in 2013. But, for some countries where debt is mostly denominated in dollar, where the currencies are fickle, this is going to be an issue. And here I'm thinking about the Turkey, Ukraine, Chile, Kenya, Argentina, Nigeria, South Africa of this world. I call them the toucans, right? These are the countries that run a twin deficit. And if the Fed is a bit, too hasty in normalizing, the currency could devaluate. They could put capital controls. That could be something that will have a recessionary effect. And for those German exporters or those European exporters that are positioned onto this supply chain, the risk of non-payment increases. The second story is China. If you think about the balance of payment of emerging markets, I would say that the US matters for the financial account, for those dollarized economies. China matters for the current account. Just think about Brazil's of this world, the Mexico, the Chile again, the Peru, these commodity exporters. If China sneezes, their entire commodity supply chain catches a cold. And so this is a little bit what we're concerned now is that some of these countries, Latin America in particular, to a certain extent, Middle East hubs, a little bit of course, the Southeast Asia trade hubs, they're going to feel a bit this pressure coming from the tightening of the financial conditions for trade and the lesser demand from China. And this is something that could be complicated for some of the European exporters that are in those supply chains and that are very dependent, for example, on demand from these countries, from guarantees from ministries of finance of these countries. When they are, when you are one of the largest exporters of industrial goods to some of these countries, you want to make sure that the currency doesn't depreciate too fast. The German exporters that felt the heat in Turkey since 2014, in Russia since 2014. This is something that we really need to keep in mind because this is one of the big differences maybe in our scenario from 12 months ago, is this idea that we may not have such a nice emerging market cycle that usually prolongs for trade exporting countries the recovery to another year or another 2 years. Talking about Germany and exports, I just want to say that there is 240 billion of extra exports to cash for German companies in 2021 and 22. Right. So even if you read that trade is decelerating, it is true, but trade is still one of the fastest recovering sectors, right? The domestic sector, especially in Germany, is recovering a bit too mellow, right? Savings rates are still high, so consumption is low, investment is strong, but everybody's waiting a bit to see what's going to happen with the coalition. If there is one sector that is going still strong, is trade. When you see here is that if I sum 2021 demand extra, so this is all additional, 21 and 22, US 25 billion, France 20 billion. We put 100 billion of recovery plan. For France, when we spend €1 in consumption, 25 cents is imported. Out of this 25 cents, a good fourth is going to Germany. So you guys should be happy that the French spend a bit more, right? China, 16 or 15 billion. The United Arab Emirates, 15 billion. Switzerland, Italy. You see that there are so many countries where in 2 years there is an extra demand for German products. And yes, we have these supply issues, but to a certain extent, there are still inventories in some sectors. And also, we expect that these supply issues phase out by the end of 2022. And so the question will be how you secure advanced commands and how do you make sure you make the bulk out of this super positioning, this competitiveness positioning. And this is important also because inflation will certainly trigger a debate in Germany about wages, as Germany is very unionized. And so the question of competitiveness is going to come very soon in the public debate. The question of whether Germany, just like the Netherlands, for example, may have to increase wages a bit more than the wine drinkers, the French and the Italian and the Spanish, because the labor market is a bit more tense, and whether this could actually have a cost on German companies' competitiveness. Another topic is climate. The electricity subsidies, the tariff subsidies in Germany are on the table for the new coalition to discuss. This is also something that could cost in terms of competitiveness. So I would say, and my word of ambition is, this is going to be windy over the next 2 years, but the more you position yourself in some of these global supply chain, the better you will be to diversify and handle the headwinds. In terms of sectors, you see that machinery and equipment, still another 35 billion to catch, electronics, 22 billion, pharmaceutical, 20 billion, metals, chemicals, 15, 17, 16 billion each. So there is still, for the traditional industrial sector in Germany, there is still quite a nice couple of years. It's risky. Insolvencies in some of these countries, Italy, Spain, China, Hungary, they are increasing again, right? We don't have the same fall of insolvencies as we observe domestically in Germany or across Europe or across Northern Europe. But there are potential opportunities, and we should certainly get after them. I mentioned a couple of times the German elections. As a French working for a German company, the German elections are always I have so many stories to tell at home when I see how the difference between our countries, right? So I don't want to give you the Franzose perspective on the German election, but there are two things that are interesting to me here. I just mentioned this issue about competitiveness and this issue about climate. They are very strong. Fiscal is also very strong a discussion. Pension is also very strong a discussion. You have all the lists. So my German economist, she's still convinced of a Jamaica coalition. Maybe because I'm French, I still think that an ample coalition is possible, but that is not what matters today. What matters today is the following, is that how come when you are Germany and you are trying to, bring in some leadership, Kissinger used to say, Germany is too big for Europe and too small for the world. Everybody's looking at Germany now to get some leadership on some of the European issues. How come trade was so little discussed, just like Europe, by the way, in the Triel and the German election? We often think about, Germany is going to be greener, Germany is going to be more competitive, Germany is going to be more inclusive. True, but how do you do that? And we try to see in what the main parties talked about, what was about trade. And you see that it's pretty benign, right? It's all about positioning themselves on trade agreements, but nothing about how do you make that happen? How do you handle the fact that, for example, a big energy transition in Germany is going to mean that Germany is going to have to import a lot more energy than it does today? What I just said about competitiveness, if you have the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or if you have some form of end of energy subsidies, or actually more energy subsidies, that you see the gas price skyrocket in Europe, how does it affect the competitiveness of German companies? If you really are serious about unplugging the thermic engine and trying to find a new way for the automotive sector, the automotive sector is 18% of the total exports of Germany. It's several million jobs, right? How do you make that happen? And I think there was not really enough on trade, which is one of Germany's forte, and certainly will continue to be as the world is in this tense trade situation, and that Europe needs to take a stance on a series of topics. I just mentioned about trade war. I think trade is going much better than under Trump. Actually, by the end of this year, we should go back to lower tariffs globally. Of course, the failure of the phase one trade deal between China and the US is not good news. But what we see is, of course, the increase that continues of harmful measures in trade, right? This is this St. Gallen survey, the Global Trade Alert. So it's interesting to see that a lot of companies are sharpening their Außenwirtschaftsverordnung laws, right? So their investment protection laws. In Germany, there is a very specific situation, the supply chain law, which is quite interesting because everybody is talking about modernizing and simplifying Germany. I'm a big fan of TÜV. because I always think, how come I have to get my skis tooth approved every season? But this is something that is everywhere. Everywhere people want to understand how you make supply chains not only greener, but also more transparent and certainly more respectful of certain standards. But this is something that will require a bit better governance. What do we do at the E level? What do we do at the country level? And you know that we have this love-hate relationship between countries and Brussels when it comes to trade, right? We have some tools that are national. We have some rules that are Europeans. We have some incentives that are national and some that are European. And of course, this idea behind the German supply chain law that by 2023, most companies will have to make sure that they comply with certain rules, especially on checking, monitoring the supply chains, is something that is creating a bit of a bureaucratic shock under the hood of the German companies. And so when I say trade war reloaded, I mean what we import as problems, right? The fact that everybody is a bit more cognizant about the fact that trade is good, but it needs to work for everybody. But also the fact that domestically, a lot of countries are also facing pushback from the constituents. You just seen what I showed about what the parties, especially the SPD, for example, they're positioning on some of the regional trade agreements. We have the same stuff in France, where it was very hard to get a form of consensus on some of this regional trade agreement. So this is an interesting time because, again, this is one of Germany's biggest engine. And then at the same time, you have this double pressure externally and internally on how to change trade at a time that trade is a bit in an economically more challenged environment. Something that we did right at I would say it was in end of 2020. So we believed back then that 2021 would be less affected by the virus, but we wanted to understand, because the rhetoric, if you do Google Trends and you look for reshoring and relocalization, every government was saying, you know, we're not going to be dependent anymore. We're going to have our own mask, our own paracetamol, our own everything, right? But when you've been working in trade for quite some time, you know that that doesn't happen overnight, or if you do that, this is very costly for the consumer, right? So we said, okay, let's ask companies. So we asked 1,000 German companies, 1,000 French, Americans, British, Italian, and we said, are you serious about reshoring? And you have the results here. They are not, you know, they most of them say maybe in the long term I will rethink, but in the short term, I you know, less than in Europe at least, less than 18% in France, 10% in Germany said I will reshore. Why? Because you can move the soloist, you don't move the orchestra, right? Something else that came up in this survey that Euler Hermes ran in the end of 2020 is, you know, we wanted to ask whether trade professionals in the companies were really spending a lot of their time on ESG. As much as we do, for example, at Euler. And the answer is yes, yeah. A third of the respondents think that they're going to have to mitigate, not, you know, positively manage, right? Some of the ESG headwinds that they see happening on trade. So the supply chain law is one of them. So that tells you that, you know, from a very financial role, you manage accounts receivable, and to a more public policy role, you have to work with government that sometimes change the law. Now there is a bit more of a compliance and risk management role for trade experts that include things that go much beyond the pure economic rationale of trading. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind as the changing environment and landscape of trade experts within the companies and what their daily routine look like. And this is quite interesting for us, and especially for what the Hermes Dekung and what Edna and her team are providing as support to their clients in Germany. I see time running by. We can talk maybe in the question and answers. You know, France is going to take the presidency of the European Union in January. Macron is interested in three things: a defense, an army, a European army. I don't think we will talk about that today. A digital tax on GAFAs, and going forward with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this idea that we need to offset a bit some of the CO2 footprint of trade, and which is something that is quite important, of course, for Germany as the major exporter, but also as a major importer of inputs to add value and then re-export. And what you see that it's changing. Here we try to list those countries that would be in a difficult situation because of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, because the toll will be on some of our trade partners. And here you see Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, South Korea, China, India, Brazil, and Taiwan. For us, these are the countries that either would like to retaliate, or from whom we're going to have an increase in prices because they may actually want to use some of their pricing power to offset the carbon border adjustment tax mechanism. And so this is something that, again, we need to monitor because Europe wants to move forward a bit faster in the first half of 2022. And maybe last thing, I talked a little bit about this before, and I will leave the floor on trade financing condition. Two things that are interesting for us is, as I said, this time around we didn't see the type of financing crunch on trade we saw in 2009. That makes this crisis very different. But central banks are normalizing. They're very slow to normalize, but to a certain extent, dollar liquidity in particular, which is the bulk of trade, is going to dictate a bit the financing condition for trade going forward. So we need to keep an eye on that. I don't think it is a 2022 story. But in 2023, these questions of financing will come back. And so this is going to be interesting to see whether some of the pressures we see on, let's say, profitability, so the price pressures, if they recede in 22, and then we have financing cost pressure, that's fine. If those two happen at the same time, so you have a bit of profitability and solvency issues at the same time with your clients, then it becomes a bit more complicated to trade with some of these countries that are in the eye of the storm, right? So we keep an eye on trade financing conditions, and right now not a priority. Other things, as you see, are providing much more headwinds. But this is something we need to keep in mind because we see already some tension in the risk-taking of some of the financiers because of the renewed trade disruptions, especially when you see what's happening in China. I think this could actually be a topic for specific countries already in 22, but the major issue will certainly be after that. With that, I stop here and I'll give you the floor, Sophia, for the discussion with Edna. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Ludovic. I think this was really a comprehensive and detailed overview on what kind of topics we have on the palette at the moment. Such a broad range of different issues. You've mentioned supply chains, ESG, you name it. And but overall, I first of all have to say I'm great to hear that you agree that we can discuss about recovery already, and we've chosen the topic for this session correctly. Maybe I've already seen one very interesting question from the audience, actually, which I would like to ask or pose to you, Ludovic, just now, because it very much relates to the presentation you just given. I just read it out. So one participant asked, looking at the actual problems we're facing worldwide, like inflation, raw material prices, supply chains, do you really think this positive trend, as you described it, will be long lasting? Yeah, I leave it to you, Ludovic, to answer that question.
So the idea is whether the input price inflation will be long lasting, right?
Yes, indeed.
We at Euler Hermes, we have a sector advisor team, right? So when we do our macro financial forecast, we always check with people that connect with the 2,000 credit analysts and underwriters that are on the ground to try to understand. So these guys usually talk to companies. What most experts of those sectors report is that it's going to be an issue again for 22, right? So a full year 2022. So it's it means, to me, this is how I see that, maybe at the very macro level, but it's a 2-year story. Could it be a 5 to 10 year story? Could it be a regime change? For that, I will need to see that there is substantial change in demand, right? I don't see change in demand. I see change in supply and maybe a sequential reopening, but I don't see, for example, and this was very interesting in the commodity sector, the pressure moved. So it was wood and then it became aluminum, and then of course semiconductors. So I have the impression it is really a plumbing problem more than all of a sudden, you know, all of the things we use have chips and aluminum. And do we have issues with some rare earth, etc.? Yes, but the semiconductor story is a story of massive divestment. And it is very interesting to see the EU response to that. The EU provides between 6 and 8% of total chips, semiconductors, you know, and their ambition is to do 20%. This is a dream. This is daydreaming. You know, we know that most of it is coming from Asia. So I think we need to stop dreaming and we need to be pragmatic. And indeed, the risk is we continue dreaming, and then we have an issue that is a bit longer than 22. But right now, our central scenario is no, it is really something about friction economics, not really about a structural change in demand for semiconductors or for any of these industrial inputs that is under pressure right now.
All right, thank you so much. And with that, I would say let's go into the discussion with you and Edna, and maybe to draw the circle a little bit more to the German export industry. So, right, a view from the German export industry. I would have one question to Edna now. Ludovic already said that recovery is in progress. We can see the graphs are going up again. So Edna, from your perspective, how do you assess the general situation for the German export industry at the moment, and also how do you perceive in our instrument the recovery process? Are we already back at normal?
Thank you very much, Sophia, and it has been extremely interesting to listen to Ludovic, because I can almost relate to everything you've been saying. We can see all that, I would say, in our discussions with exporters. We can see that in our books. We can see that with the political discussion we are having. So I can very much relate to it. And yes, we definitely see the recovery in our books as well. As some of you might know, 2020 was a very extraordinary year for this instrument because, of course, we saw the crisis. We saw many new applicants who needed cover, but it was very small volumes because the big tickets, they were not coming last year. So the volume was quite low. And we see this year really, I would say, normalizing, so reversing the trends from last year. We are up again with the volumes. We are seeing larger projects coming in. Our pipeline is actually growing significantly. So there seems to be quite some demand and new projects, also very large, I would say, infrastructure projects coming up. So it's definitely, I would say, a recovery in that sense. Of course, we still have sectors where you can say the recovery will still need some time, especially sectors like cruise ship sector, where we had these deferrals of payments for several years, which helped the industry a lot, but they are still, I would say, not back to normal operations yet. So there are some sectors still struggling, but on a good way, I would say. So the measures we took last year, they really helped. And what I can say is, I think what also helped is that we kept our risk policy very stable despite deteriorating numbers of many buyers we saw last year. But the government was very strong, I would say, pushing for keeping the risk policy remaining stable. So I think that helped, together with the so-called Schutzschirm for the private credit insurance. So a lot of good measures on the side of the German government to support trade here, and it has really helped. So we are up now 40% cover volumes. So it will be interesting to see how that will go on, because there are some uncertainties, of course, still there, and Ludovic has touched upon them. Right now, we don't see a large number of claims. Only in the aircraft sector, we've had some payment problems, I would say, of some aircraft companies, but we don't see a lot of claims. But we see quite some uncertainty looking at the emerging countries, of course, which are the buyers' countries of our exporters. And I just had a look at your upcoming insolvency report, Ludovic, and there you were saying that well, you are anticipating that in Africa, but also Latin America, there will probably be some rising insolvencies coming up, depending a little bit, of course, on vaccination, on how Corona will continue. But so there is still some uncertainty, and I think, well, I don't have the crystal ball. You are the economist. I'm only a lawyer, so I don't have it. But yeah, I think we will. It remains to be seen whether we will see a rise in claims maybe next year. But I think this year we are pretty safe on that we will end up with a positive result, I would say, for this instrument. So that's maybe on the side what we see from what Ludovic was saying in our books.
Yes, thank you so much, Edna. I think very interesting insights, and also a little bit completing the picture Ludovic was drawing already. So now we have a view around the whole topic, and now I would like to go one layer deeper actually into the discussion and again touch upon the topic of global supply chains. I mean, Ludovic, you've already made a lot of points on that topic, and basically stating that of course global supply chains remain relevant. We do, I mean, reshoring and nearshoring are points in discussion and are controversially discussed by many experts, but still you've said that the tendencies are not long lasting and global supply chains will remain. However, I would like to discuss now one other dimension of this discussion actually. So my question is taking it more from a regional or political perspective. You've already mentioned the German supply chain law, as well as protectionist tendencies in the US and maybe also in Eastern Asia. So my question is, how would you assess the current situation from that view, and how would you assess challenges German exporters have to face in the near future, taking those topics into consideration?
You want to start, or if this is for me, Sophia, the question?
I would say let's start with you, Ludovic, and then we go to Edna.
There are two ways to look at the German trade, right? It's a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because, this is the success stories of the 2000s for Germany. I wish, globalization, everybody loves globalization. It brought us very cheap TVs, smartphones. That is the beginning of the 2000 stories. The late 2000 stories is another story of globalization, where we started to see outsourcing. So for example, as a French, I saw my country deindustrialize very strongly in the 2010. Whereas in Germany, I saw, of course, building on the Hartz reform, but also on a vision, I think, that Germany had to be very mercantilist and a superpower. The idea was to say, okay, we have several internal issues in Germany, and one way to solve these issues is to create a bit of external pressure. It's like a pressure cooker, yeah. And Germany started to get very much in line in addressing global demand. And the paroxysm, I mean, the apex of this moment is, of course, the Euro crisis, because the Euro crisis showed that Germany was very strong at finding demand outside of Europe if the European partners were lacking demand. Yeah. So for me, it's the miracle, it's the Wunderkind, it's the Wunderwirtschaft story of Germany. I think it's very, when you look, and there are plenty of very cool papers on how the German companies hunt together for clients, how the private sector is organized around that, the Handelskammer. This is quite fascinating. In my country, France, we miss a full generation of exporters. We have half the number of exporters that Germany has, and we have 2/3 of exporters of Italy. So it's not only Germany, but Italy also did quite. It's more an SME base. Germany has the Mittelstand, which is a bit bigger, but so this is fascinating, because this is what created a lot of wealth, a lot of jobs, and certainly a form of influence, right? But there is a shadow to that sun, right? And the shadow is Germany trade structure is very dependent on the thermic engine. it's very dependent on being able to supply at a rather cheap cost. So there's this idea that Germany adds value, but Germany's competitiveness is also based on it being very integrated in very long supply chain, right? And for example, there is also the very interesting things that Germany is a very poor foreign direct investor. So Germany as an export location is one of the best. It's, you know, Handelsweltmeister, yeah. But Germany as an investor is not very good. so that's quite fascinating. And so I think going forward, you know, I don't think these supply chain disruptions are going to last, but it is questioning a bit the hyperdependence, yeah. So the hyperdependence on not necessarily on client countries. I think this is the diversification is still the key, but the hyperdependence on some sectors, machinery and equipment, automotive, you know, that are very under strong regulatory backlash because of climate change, yeah, because of the fight against climate change, right? The EU Fit for 55, which is an 800-page document that nobody reads, is much bigger shock than the WLTP emission measures that created a recession in Germany in Q3 2018. People have forgotten that. But there was, you know, a big shock on the German automotive sector because of emission regulation in 2018 before the crisis, right? In 2019, it was actually the epitome of that. What we see coming our way is, and I mentioned the carbon border adjustment tax, but more generally, if you rethink the EU-Umbau, you know, the feed tariffs, this is quite massive a transformation. And so, for example, for me, I think the keys are still in the hands of the German companies, because there are a lot of savings. There is a lot of cash on balance sheet right now. There are a lot of opportunities to invest. The problem is that we lack a bit time, because green and innovation go hand in hand. You know, and we saw that with the energy vendor in Germany. You know, 130 billion over 10 years. The result is, you know, it didn't work that well in changing the energy mix, right? So for me, this is going to be the challenge of the next 10 years for Germany, is that how do you, you know, define not only what you want to be, but how you make that happen? Because you have a structure, you have structural economic, you know, the way, you know, the Mittelstand is structured, the family-owned enterprises, the type of jobs that depend on that, the skills, you know. So how do you activate this to be fit for the transition? And I think, again, I was very disappointed that this debate didn't happen much during the election, because this is a major debate. Because what happens if regulatory shocks, little by little, indent the power of Germany to continue to be gaining traction from trade, right? Little by little, if the sovereignty discussion becomes the main discussion of Europe, and Europe did become very French, yeah? Europe did become obsessed with European champions, which is completely at the opposite of German ordoliberalismus, yeah? If this debate wins, you know, that means Germany is up for very strong headwinds going forward. So for me, you know, again, this has been the strength of the past 20 years. It should be the strength of the next 20 years. There is no reason why magically the economic laws would change, you know. But how you make your structure fit for the future is I think major, especially because of these vulnerable supply chains, right? On the thermic engine, on energy and competitiveness. This requires massive investment, public and private.
Thank you so much, Ludovic. And I think for a representative of an ECA, it's music in my ears to hear that Germany is Handelsweltmeister, especially coming from your words. I just grabbed one phrase that you said, that was, how do you make it happen? We have a vision, but how do we make it happen? And I think with that phrase, I would pass over to Edna to hear your view on the challenges we face in the context of global supply chains, as well as ESG hurdles. So what's your view to it? How would you phrase it?
Yeah, I can agree on a lot what Ludovic has said. I mean, export is so important for Germany. And I see it, of course, more maybe on the positive note than being an economist. It's 12 million jobs depending actually on it. So and it's either how you count it, almost half of the GDP in some years, depending on exports. So it's so important, and that's why I was also, I have to say, disappointed to see the lack of this topic in the pre-election discussion and in the programs of the parties, because of course we analyze it as well. And I think part of that is because there is a notion that, you know, everything is going well. We see the upswing, you know, so that's, you know, nothing we have to worry about. But I agree with Ludovic that we have homework to do, because there is really many challenges for German exporters coming up. We have trade barriers increasing instead of decreasing, right? We have the green transition you were mentioning. It requires a lot of investment. It requires a lot of change. So that will of course affect. We have political tensions. We have the topic that exporters have to navigate between sanctions and blocking regulations. So we have the competitors from China with massive support from their state, their government entities. So I think it's getting more uncomfortable, I would say, than it used to be. So I think we really have to do our homework. And looking ahead, you know, and if I look at in 10 years' time, where would I see Germany there and German export? I definitely think we can make it in terms of high tech made in Germany. I think we have the industrial base. We have the entire supply chain locally in some parts here. So I think we really can make it, especially in the green tech area where I think we can be leading. But that will, of course, require, I would say, a strong strategy by the new government starting very soon after the election. So if we have a good strategy there, if we get R&D investments, I think we can really make it. And that, of course, green tech, for example, will have huge potential for exports in the future as well. So I think there is a lot of potential, but we do have to do our homework. So I agree with that. Over.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Edna. And I think that's the perfect bridge for me now to have a look on the other side of the coin. I mean, we've spoken about risks. We have spoken about a vision that we need, the German export industry need to evolve over the next 10 years. So my question, or I would now like to turn to the opportunities for the German export industry. And maybe a first question to you, Ludovic. I mean, despite bringing a lot of burdensome effects for the economy, the corona crisis at the same time has also accelerated some of the more recent positive trends, such as digitization and so forth. So my question is, what positive developments do you foresee for the export industry? And especially for the German exporters, where should we put our focus on?
Short term, you know, the US and Europe, I mean, the privilege of the advanced economies is that they did a massive recovery packages, right? They did a series of very strong, I mean, if you think about the US, you know, it's 5.1 trillion, and maybe, you know, 30% of that doesn't pass Congress, but it's still so huge, you know. 2 trillion of infrastructure, you know, this green and inclusive infrastructure. Okay, this is something, you know, if I'm a German company today, I'm gonna, and you know, I already speak English, but I will certainly make sure that I understand how public affairs work in the States, how I can bid, because, you know, there is buy local, and, you know, since the 30s, America is very protectionist with local procurements, but I would establish a branch. I would try to do whatever so that my technology is recognized as one of the best contributors to green and inclusive infrastructure. You know, there's so much demand, and this is just public demand. But think about the private demand. We have in Europe 500 billion excess savings. 500 billion. People have been hoarding money because they're worried about the future, because they're worried about the pension, and they should in Germany, because they're worried about you know, what the future may come. This is demand in the making. So if I'm an exporter, German exporter, I look at these countries where there is still substantial public stimuli and where there is still a lot of private savings, because I know there I will have demand. Yeah. And if I also think about my pricing power, because this is the key, right? How can I develop innovation, increase productivity so that I can then sell my products a bit more, expensive? I can make more money, more banks for the buck. Yeah. And this is again where in countries, Germany has a history of being extremely competitive when it comes to the car sector because of the choice that was made to go on high-end, high gamut type of automotive. So I would also, I would have a volume and I would have a price approach. And yes, it's going to be rocky. Yes, it's going to be bumpy. But again, I don't remember a period where it was not, so so the opportunities are out there. The cost base is very important. The alliances you make, especially with suppliers, the diversification. I think risk managers are rediscovering the importance of second tier, third tier suppliers because they felt in their flesh the shortages. So I think this is big. Edna mentioned a couple of in terms of sectors, right? And there was a question by one of the listeners on the European champions. I think Europe is very ambitious when it comes to green and technology. The Americans put more money, but we have the ideas, right? So they have the money, we have the ideas. But when you see what Minister Altmaier has been developing on battery, now what's happening on hydrogen, Europe is really putting money on trying to develop this ecosystem. Does it mean that we're going to have the same type of entrepreneurial state that America has, where they've been pouring billions at all of this innovation, from Apple to the internet for decades? No. Does it mean there is a change of heart? Yes. I was mentioning this thing between Europe becoming a bit more French, getting away from this very laissez-faire approach that the Germans have been proning in Europe. This is good in this way, which is we are creating a public-private partnership 2.0. And I think this is what this crisis taught us. This crisis taught us that there are, Kurzarbeit is a good example. You need the public and the private sector to work hand in hand to make it work, right? And so for some of these sectors, you have to have a first tranche, which is high risk, low reward, where maybe you need the public sector, and green transition is certainly one of those. And then you have a second tranche where you need to activate existing savings, right? So for me, Germany has the solidity to be a very strong part of green hydrogen, of electric cars, the Industry 4.0 was a wonderful show and tell about the robotization in Germany and how smart and connected some of the old style, welding and so forth could be. So I think there are success stories everywhere. Everywhere you look, there are success stories. You go to a small town in Germany and you meet a guy who has been exporting in Argentina for 20 years. And as an economist, I look at Argentina and this is, they have sometimes 3 currencies, they are in default every 3 years. And this guy barely speaks Spanish, but his daughter went to school and studied Spanish, and he's been making millions in Argentina for 10 years, This is what Germany is good at. So the opportunities are many. The way, and this is why the Hermes-Deckung is so important, the toolbox is becoming even more important than before, because you need, again, this walk hand in hand between what you can do alone if you're informed and what you need to go for the private sector for some support, banking, where maybe that is what I should in Germany, but we wouldn't go into that. I think the banks are a bit anxious about trade. Credit insurance, and no, we are not anxious, we can insure you. And then there is the Deckung also. This is a rocket with several etages. So I think there is a lot there, and we shouldn't wait for a structural transformation that would come from the sky. We should just get going, which is also what the Germans are very good at. They're very pragmatic with that. So I see only opportunities, to be honest. But it's it's rocky. So you need to be informed, get the right companions, and also try to see, this rebalancing in the economy, on infrastructure, on green infrastructure, on technology, on this. This is something where, again, I think the German companies could invest a bit more or partner more to make sure they keep the edge that they've had, because this is going to be very important in the decade to come. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ludovic. Edna, Ludovic only sees opportunities. I guess you would agree, don't you?
Absolutely. And so I can just say there it will be a little bit bumpy, the road, but that's what we're here for. So I like your idea of public-private partnership, which has to be strengthened. I truly believe in that. So let's get going. I think that's what I would echo as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, the two of you. I just had a look at the watch, and it's already 10:33 now, so we're a little about time. And unfortunately, that means to me that I have to bring this discussion to an end now. But still, I think this was a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much to both of you for participating, for your openness, for your creativity. I think we have a really good picture on how it should look like in the next couple of years. So let's get to work. Also, a big thank you to the audience for your interest and for tuning in. So yeah, thank you so much to all of you. And with that, I wish us all a wonderful day, an inspiring day, and take good care. Bye.
Thank you, Sophia. Thanks to everyone. Have a great day. Thanks, Ludovic.
Thank you so much, Edna.
Bye-bye.
Bye.